Okay, welcome everybody to Leak Disruptive Torah. And this week, I'm Rabbi Adam Mintz. Today, we welcome Rabbi Avraham Bronstein of the Hampton Synagogue in West Hampton Beach to join me for a conversation. The conversation today is to hit the rock or not to hit the rock. That is the question. And the sources are in the chat. Everybody is welcome to look at the sources on the chat. Hello, Rabbi Bronstein. How are you today?
Hello, Rabbi Mintz. It is a pleasure to be here with you again. It was a pleasure to spend Shavuot with you here at the Hampton Synagogue, where I am right now. And it's really great to be continuing the conversation with you.
Amazing. And now we're going to study this together and we'll share it, whether it'll be in Manhattan, the Hamptons, the Greek Isles, or all the different places in between. This is, arguably the most famous story in the entire Torah, which is Moses hitting the rock. And let's start, Rabbi Bronstein, by reading the verses together. And maybe we can read them just for fun, you and me. I'll start reading in Hebrew and we'll translate. The verses are here in Hebrew and in English, and we'll translate and we'll kind of interpret as we go along.
Sounds like a plan.
Vayavo'u b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edah midbar Tzin. And the Jewish people arrived in a body at the wilderness of Tzin. B'chodesh Rishon, in the first month, Vayeshev ha'am beKadesh, and they stayed in Kadesh. Vatamat sham Miriam vatikaver sham. And Miriam, who's Moshe's sister, dies there. Now, Rabbi Bronstein, what's interesting is, and we talked about this yesterday, is the commentators say that right here in Numbers chapter 20, the Torah jumps from year number 2 in the desert to year number 40 in the desert. Now, what's interesting is that the Torah doesn't say that it's jumping, but it looks like it jumps here. And the Torah seems to be telling you what happened at the end of the time in the desert. 39 years in the desert, 38 years in the desert are not discussed in the Torah. What do you make of that?
It's an incredible thing, and it's even more incredible because, as you just said, the Torah doesn't actually tell you, by the way, 38 years have gone by and now we're at the end. So it's almost as though the Torah is implicitly trying to blur the line a little bit. It's at the end of the story. There's a new generation that this is happening to. There's a whole different Jewish people now than there were who left Egypt. But it's a little bit confusing because it looks like the same people. It looks like a continuation of the episode that happened before, but it's not. And as we were discussing yesterday, that could be setting us up a little bit for the perspective of Moshe himself, who's going to be looking out at the people and thinking this is something that he remembers from the recent past, but actually he's remembering an episode that happened for him in the distant past.
Good. So that is really interesting. The fact that the Torah intentionally doesn't tell us that it's jumping, because it wants to leave that a little ambiguous here, right? It wanted that it shouldn't be so clear that we're jumping from one story to the other. Okay, let's go on. There was no water. The rabbis tell us that it was in the merit of Miriam that they had water. So Miriam dies, and now they don't have water. Vayikahalu al Moshe ve'al Aharon. And of course, this is an old story. Again, you point out this is an old story and a new story. The people joined against Moses and Aaron. Vayarev ha'am im Moshe. And the people quarreled with Moshe. Vayomru lemor. And they said to him, if only we had perished when our brothers perished at the instance in front of God. Right? Meaning we should have died too. Why did you bring us here to die in the desert? So here, Rabbi Bronstein, this is boring already, right? How many times are they going to say the same thing, right? Why'd you take us out of Egypt to die in the desert? We would have been better had we died in the desert, right? Crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Why'd you take us out of Egypt? Lo mikom zera, Uteina v'gefen v'rimon. It's not a place where there's no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates. Umayim ayin lishtot, and there's not even water. You
More
go on, Ido.
remarkable based on what you were saying before, in terms of the ambiguity, right? If this is really the 40th year of the wandering through the wilderness, then most of the people who are arguing with Moses and Aaron right now were not actually in Egypt. Right. And they're saying, why did you take us out of Egypt to bring us to this place? And they're using the exact same language. But for them, Egypt was not even a memory. So it's not even like they had this distorted vision of nostalgia back towards Egypt, like maybe they would have had a generation earlier. Here, it's something which is completely in their heads.
Right. And clearly they've been taken care of for 39 years in the desert, right? So they, however they've been taken care of with the mun or whatever it is. So this is just troublemaking. You might say that when they crossed the sea and they were worried about water, that was legitimate. They didn't know where they were going to get water from. But here they know that God's going to take care of them. So what are they complaining about? Again, good. It's some kind of blur between all 40 years, between the experience when they left Egypt and now the new experience. Vayavo Moshe v'Aharon mipnei hakahal el petach ha'omoed. They come to the entrance of the tent. Vayiplu al pneihem. They fall on their faces. Vayirak vod Hashem alehem. And God appears to them. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Kach et hamateh. V'hakel et ha'ida ata v'Aharon achicha. V'dibartem el hasela. God says to Moshe, take the staff. This is a famous staff, the staff. Gather the people, you and Aharon, and speak to the rock in front of their eyes. V'natan memav, and the rock will give water. V'hotzeita lahem mayim min hasela, v'ishkita et ha'ida ve'et be'ira. And you'll bring out water from the rock, and you will be able to give water to them and to their animals. So, Rabbi Bronstein, in this pasuk, is there anything that's strange, or this pasuk is pretty good? The direction to Moshe is pretty clear. Is that right?
It seems very straightforward. Absolutely.
Right? Speak to the rock. Vayikach Moshe tamateh, and Moshe takes this staff. Hashem, kasher tzivahu. So the first pasuk says he takes the staff. That's also clear. God says take the staff. Moshe takes the staff. So we're set up that it's all perfect.
Right, kasher tzivahu.
Right, kasher tzivahu means there's basically no drama up to now. This is going to be a story like all the other stories that God tells Moshe what to do. Moshe performs the miracle. They have water, they have food, and they live happily ever after. But then, Vayakilu Moshe v'Aharon et hakahal el pnei hasala. Moshe and Aaron gather the people around the rock. That's also in fulfilling God's command. The pasuk says, "V'hakel et ha'idata v'Aharon achicha." Right? So that's also exactly what's supposed to be. Vayomer lahem, Shimuna hamorim. Listen, you rebels. Hamin hasela hazeh notzi lachem mayim. Shall we get water for you out of this rock? Now, right here we have a turn. Because right here Moshe is not in character. What exactly is Moshe saying? Listen, you rebels. Shall we get water for you out of this rock? How do you understand that verse?
So I think the easy way to understand it, or the simplest way would be to understand it would be, he's basically saying, he's saying, do you think that we can't get water out of this rock, basically?
Yeah, I mean, he's angry. Well, right.
He's angry
at the people. Right. The
and he's
key
saying,
word here is the word morim. He
right. He's
calls
saying,
them
do you really think this is not going to work?
Right. Listen, you rebels, you troublemakers. You say we don't have any water. Hamin hasel hazen notzi lachem mayim means, see, it's interesting. Sefaria translates it as a question. Shall we get water for you out of this rock? But I think, Rabbi Bronstein, you're saying it much better. Listen, you rebels. Obviously, there's a word obviously that's missing. Obviously, we're going to get water from this rock, right? I don't know. Why do you think there's a question mark in the Sfaria? I don't know where Sfaria takes that from.
Well, it's from the hey in Hamin Hasala Hazeh,
Yeah,
right?
but
It's
from the way Moshe talks, it seems like it would be better without that question mark at the end. Hamin, right? You could understand that as a question, or you could understand that as being declarative.
right. The other way I was thinking about it is that it parallels what Moshe says to the people, or how the Torah describes the people way back in Parashat Beshalach. Not the first time they ask for water, but the second time, because it's Vayikra, over there it says Vayikra Shem Hamakom Masa Umeriva, that they'll call the place where the water was Masa and Meriva. That's where Moshe first hits the rock.
Right,
Al Riv B'nai Israel, because the people quarreled. V'al Nas Sotem et Hashem Lemor, and there they tested, or they tried God, saying, quote, Hayesh Hashem bikirbeinu imayin. Is God present among us or not? I was thinking possibly what is happening over here is Moshe is saying, you rebels who say, right?
right.
Hamin hazela hazeh notzi lachem mayim. Are you going to bring us water out of this rock? There's no water here. I mean, that phrase is him kind of taking the people's words and throwing it back at them. Shimu naha morim, right? Listen, you rebels. How are you rebels? Hamin hasela hazeh notzi lachem mayim. From this rock, are you going to bring us water? I mean, that's what
Good,
the people are asking about Moshe and Aharon.
good. That's really good.
And
And you
I'm saying, and in that way, it kind of parallels the other story.
Good. So that was going to say, you're raising a really interesting point. Because actually, this story is a duplicate of a story that we have in Parshat Beshalach, which is right after the Jews crossed the sea. We have exactly the same story. Now, the problem is that in that story, Moshe hits the rock, and Moshe does the right thing by hitting the rock. And here, Moshe hits the rock, and he's punished for hitting the rock. So the scholars are all bothered by that. Are these two stories or they're one story? So actually, Rabbi Bronstein, your point is interesting because you're saying it's not necessarily one story, but this story is playing off of the other story. Because in the other story, Moshe also was critical of the people.
Yes. Well, over there,
Yes.
actually, Moshe is critical of the people, but then the narrator, the Torah itself, is critical of the people, and it quotes them. It says, it's telling you what they said. They said, "Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayin." Here, Moshe is kind of putting himself into that role, right? Moshe could be telling the people, "You terrible people who are saying, Hamin hasasi lachem mayim."
So that so if we look down for a minute at the Ramban, and
Mm-hmm.
here there's an underline in the Ramban. The Ramban points out, he says, but this question here that Moshe asked of them was a probing question to test their true intention. He said to them, hear now, ye rebels, what do you devise against the eternal? Are we to bring you forth water out of this strong rock? Will this event happen or not? Do you believe that it was in his power to do it or not? And I think, Rabbi Bronstein, that's really what you're saying. And that's a great little Ramban, because the Ramban is explaining this line. What he's saying is, you troublemakers, are you questioning God? Do you think that God can't make this happen? Right? That's really the way he's saying. Shimu nahamorim, you rebels. Hamin hasela hazen nosi lachemayim. Are you really questioning whether or not God can bring water from this rock?
100%. Whether that line is phrased as Moshe's critique of the people, or whether it's Moshe quoting the people back to themselves in an angry, critical kind of way, the Ramban's comment still holds. Right? It's a
Right, that's
challenge to the
that's
people.
correct. It's a
Right? By
challenge
by
to the people. That's why I
complaining,
like
by
that Ramban. It's a challenge to the people. And the Ramban actually understands that question mark. But it's a question mark as a critique of the people. You're questioning whether God can do this. Of course God can do this. So it's kind of almost a rhetorical question mark.
Right. And in that way, it's like this story is an exact copy. It plays out exactly the same way as the previous story, right?
That's
Previously, the people wondered, Hayesh Hashem bikirbeinu im ayin, is God really present among us or not? And now that the water went away, the people have the exact same question, basically. Is God among us or not? Is God going to do this or not?
right. Very good. Vayorem Moshe et yado. And here we have kind of the disruptive Torah, except here the disruptive Torah is achieved by Moshe.
It's in
Moshe
the Torah.
raises his hand, Vayach et hasela b'matehu, and he strikes the rock with his stick, pa'amayim. And we'll come back to that, right, Bronstein? That's interesting, pa'amayim. It's one thing you hit the rock, but why do you have to hit it twice, right? Vayetzu mayim rabim v'teish ta'ida uvira. So the problem with this disruptive pasuk is, number one, Moshe does the wrong thing. God says, speak to the rock, and Moshe hits the rock. Moshe hits the rock twice. We have to understand why it's twice. But you might have thought if Moshe did the wrong thing that water wouldn't come from the rock. But water came from the rock, and and there was water for the people and for their animals. So what do you make of this puzzle? What do you make of this disruptive puzzle?
Right. So he's not doing what he was supposed to do, but he got the right result. And you would think maybe at that point, getting the right result means that things are going to be fine, but it turns out that they're not.
Right. So that point, I think, we'll look at Rashi in 1 second, but that point is a super important point. You see, the drama unfolding is really what's exciting here. He starts off that God tells Moshe what to do. Moshe does what he's supposed to do. But now then there's a disruptive pasuk. And you think that here Moshe broke the rules, but they got water. So you have the impression, okay, Moshe broke the rules. In Bishalach, he hit the rock, and that was the right thing to do. So maybe it's our problem. Maybe we don't understand what God said to Moshe. God said V'dibartem el hasela, but he didn't really mean V'dibartem el hasela. He meant hit the rock, because the rock gave water, and that's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, I was just thinking based on what you were saying, and I've wondered about this on and off, previously, when God tells Moshe, "V'dibartem el hasala le'enehem v'natan meimav," they could have understood that God wasn't telling them to, say, "Please, rock, give us water" in front of the people. God could have been telling them to address the people in the presence of the rock. And they would have thought that when they were critiquing the people as they were back in verses in verse 10, that was God's command, and then they just hit the rock the same way that they did previously.
Of course, that's the other way to read these psukim. We'll read Rashi in a second, who doesn't read it like that. But of course, v'dibartem el hasela, you'll speak to the rock, and then you'll hit the rock. And God doesn't need to tell Moshe, then you'll hit the rock, because he told him before that then you'll hit the rock. And here's another place where your point is right, the blurring of the time here. You can't really tell. Maybe this is happening, 2 months after the original story. It's very hard to know. And therefore, of course, it reflects back on that story. So God says, speak to the rock, and quotation, and parentheses, which are in here, and then hit the rock. And that's not there. But Rashi doesn't learn that way. Look at Rashi. Pa'amayim, he smote the rock twice, because at the first attempt, it did not bring forth more than a few drops. For God had not bidden him smite it. But he had said, and you shall speak to the rock. They had indeed spoken, but to a different rock, not that which God had intended, for it had not given forth water. They said, perhaps it is necessary to smite it as on the former occasion when it says, and you shall smite the rock. And just that rock intended by God happened to be there, and they smote it, but without effect. And so they smote it a second time. So Rashi here seems to say two slightly different things. Why did they hit it twice? He hit it twice because the first time it only gave a little bit of water. And then he seems to suggest that maybe the first time it didn't give any water because it was the wrong rock. And then he hit it twice, and the second time it was the right rock, so it gave water. What do you make of that,
Right.
Rashi?
Right. Rashi is trying to explain two questions. Question number one is if God says, hit the rock, why would Moshe have spoken to it? Second question, like you indicated before, was if Moshe had decided to hit the rock, why did he hit it twice?
Right.
So it's like a double answer, right? Answer one was obviously he spoke to the rock first because that's what God commanded him to do. It's just not in the text because that speaking was ineffective because he was speaking to the wrong rock. And he had to hit it twice because it didn't work the first time because it was still the wrong rock. But it happened to be the second time he kind of grazed the right rock, and that's where the water came from. So Rashi still has to deal with, like, in a narrative sense, you know, if God had told him to to speak to the rock instead of hitting it, even if he hit it by accident the second time, why does that work, as it were? It still doesn't quite make sense that way, but those are the two questions, at least, that Rashi is grappling with here.
Right. Now, Rashi seems to have this idea that the wrong rock will not give water, regardless whether you speak to it or hit it. The right rock will give water whether you hit it or speak to
Or
it,
speak
right?
to it.
Right. It's a function of the rock. It's not a function of Moshe's action. Now that's not explicit in the text, but that's the way Rashi resolves the problem. He spoke to the first rock, which was the wrong rock, and he hit the second rock, which was the right rock. Even though he did the wrong thing by hitting the second rock, but he but he but it was the right rock, so therefore it gave water. And you're right, and that's the way he resolves the question. Why did it give water? Was the wrong rock.
Right. Or why did it give water? It was the wrong action. He still should have been
Yeah,
speaking to it.
right, correct, right. That's correct. Sorry, right was the wrong action. The first
Right.
one was the wrong rock. The second one was the right rock, wrong action, but it still gave the
But it still gave water.
water.
Right. Maybe like in some, in Rashi's mind, in some kind of narrative way, what happened here was, as you had referenced before, the well had existed for them previously in the merit of Miriam, and it traveled with them, according to the rabbis, through the wilderness. So there was like a rock that was the official rock, right? There was the rock that functioned as a well for them over their course of traveling through the wilderness. The only thing was that they had to kind of reactivate it. So by speaking to the wrong rock, Moshe wasn't activating it, but by hitting it, maybe he was reactivating it.
Good.
That could
I
be what's
think
going
that's
on
good.
here.
I mean, that little piece, which also is not in the text, is good. You see, if we believe the way the rabbis explain that the water came because of Miriam, it means that they had reason to be concerned because they had water for 40 years, right? The water was just there. But all of a sudden, Miriam dies. Now they don't have water. So that's a crisis. It actually takes
Mhm.
them back to the first story in Bishalach. It's the crisis moment where they don't have water. What are they supposed to do?
Right. I think
Right?
that's true.
Okay, good. Now, again, like we said, the pasuk verse 6 is so sorry, not the verse 11 is disruptive. But now what happens in verse 12? Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aharon. Ya'an. Ya'an means because. Lo he'emantem bi, because you didn't listen to me. Lahakdisheni, to sanctify me. Le'inei b'nei Yisrael, to the eyes of the Jewish people. Lachein, therefore. Lo taviu et hakahal hazeh el haaretz asher natati lahem. Therefore, you will not lead the people into the land. Hema me meriva sheravu b'nei Yisrael et Hashem vayikadesh bam. Now, you know what I like the best of those two psukim? The last two words, vayikadesh bam. You see, in these two verses, the word that doesn't seem to be necessary is the word lahakdisheni, vayikadesh bam. God says to Moshe, hit the rock. I'm going to talk to the rock. Moshe hits the rock, and Moshe seems to be punished. What does lahakdisheni have to do with it? And what does it mean vayikadesh bam? And these are the waters of Merivah, meaning that the Israelites quarreled with God, whose sanctity was affirmed through them. How was God's sanctity affirmed through this story? What do you think?
Right? So we've seen that term used before when somebody does something wrong and they're punished, right? After Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's first oldest two sons, die for encroaching upon the sanctuary in a way they weren't supposed to. So God tells Moshe, Hashem tells Moshe, and Moshe tells Aaron, Bikrovai ekhadesh, v'alpanecha ha'am echaved, that God is sanctified by those who are close to you, meaning the crime and punishment, or the punishment which follows the crime, is itself a sanctification of God's name because it shows that the rules are serious and that the consequences are swift. It
Right.
could be that happening here, right? As you know, though, other commentators explain that what it really means is Moses missed an opportunity to sanctify God's name in front of the people, and therefore the punishment serves as a replacement sanctification of God's name because of an opportunity that Moses himself missed in the positive sense.
Right. I would just say that really the two things you just said are really the same. Because Bikrovaya Kadesh, the punishment served to sanctify God because the people, Nadav and Avihu, didn't actually sanctify God. So they needed to sanctify it through the punishment. Right? So it's the same thing. Sometimes the punishment, the swiftness of the punishment, that is what sanctifies God's name. But what's interesting is that it all is about a Kiddush Hashem. It's all about sanctifying God's name. That seems to be what God's upset about. Moshe had a chance to sanctify God's name, and he missed the chance. Yeah.
The question is going to be, what chance did Moshe miss? What did he do wrong exactly?
Right. So that's a different. Now, do you want to? We have 5 minutes left. Do you want to look at the Hamek Davar, or do you want to look at the Medrash and Shmot Rabbah?
So I think we can look at the Hamek Davar because it flows from this conversation. Right, the Hamek Davar written by the Netziv, right, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, from the 19th century in Lithuania. He tries to figure out exactly what the difference is theologically between hitting the rock and speaking to the rock. And he tries to develop the point because he wants to explain when God tells Moshe, you missed a chance to sanctify my name in front of the people. What chance did Moshe miss? What was supposed to have happened and what happened instead? And the way that he explains it, I'll just summarize it because we only have 5 minutes left, is that the point that he's making is that now that we're 40 years into the wilderness, God wants the people to be moving from a state of being where they're sustained by open miracles and by the rules of nature bending to sustain them and to support them at every step of the way, to a place where they're living a more or less natural life, but they're praying for God's intervention in ways that will be beneficial to them. So if they're in the land of Israel, we're going to read about this a lot in Devarim, so they're going to plant their crops and the rain will either fall or not fall. So therefore, the people are conditioned to pray to God in order for the rain to fall. So this was going to be the first lesson in that curriculum. There was going to be no water. They were going to pray together. They were going to daven for rain or for water to come out of the rock, and then the water would come and it would sustain them, and it would teach them if you need something from God, you pray for it, and then God answers you. Instead, Moses stands there before them and actively performs a miracle, which was the model that he had been using for 40 years in the wilderness, which was the wrong model for the people that were about to enter the promised land. So what God is upset about is he's telling Moshe, look, it's been 40 years since this has started. They're ready for the advanced course. They're ready for the graduate seminar, but you're still teaching them Theology 101.
Which of course highlights the real issue here, and that is that the leader who took them out of Egypt can't be the leader who takes them into the land. Because the leader who takes them out of Egypt, he's still at 1.1, right? And they need 2.1. They need a leader who can teach them 2.1. It's really amazing how the Hamek Davar reads that into this story. But that's really, the point here. And it's your point. We really end where we started. And that is, it's your point. And that is, in Moshe's mind, there was no jump from year 2 to year 40. There was no jump at all. It's all the same. The Torah is actually reflecting Moshe's view that it all flows one to the next, right? But what the Hamek Davar points out is that is exactly Moshe's mistake. And that's why Moshe is punished. Not so much punished. Yes, I would just add to that. According to the Hamek Davar, it's not a punishment. It's that it just has to be that way. It has to be that Moshe is not going to be the one who leads them into the land.
It's a natural thing. So I could just reference now that bit of midrash that we were talking about yesterday. The midrash says actually it's not specifically even a crime and punishment here, or a sin and punishment, but it was part of God's plan from the very, very beginning that Moshe was not going to be the one to lead the people into the promised land. And even back when they were still in Egypt, that was still the idea. Why? Because maybe if, maybe the sorts of things that we're saying now, the leader who takes you out of Egypt, the one who does all the miracles for you, by definition can't be the one who establishes you in a more permanent workaday kind of environment. So this story was not a particular sin that Moses committed, and his punishment was not being allowed to enter the land. Instead, what the Midrash is kind of hinting at, and the Netziv, the Hamikdavar goes there as well, is that this story kind of reflects an overarching reality, which is that Moshe's time has come and gone, and the people to a certain degree have moved past him already, and they're ready for a leader of their generation who could take them to the next step.
That is a great place to end. And that is that the people are moving on. Unfortunately, Moshe, their leader, is not moving on with them. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rabbi Bronstein. This was great. I look forward to talking about further Parshio together with you. But we look forward to having Geoffrey back next week. Rabbi Bronstein continues success in the Hampton Synagogue July 4th weekend and for the entire summer. Happy July 4th to everybody. Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week on Madlik Disruptive Torah. Shabbat Shalom and happy July 4th. Be well.
Shabbat Shalom.